Once upon a time, if you even knew what a 20-sided die was for, you could expect a lot of this. Today, dragons, wizards, and elves are part of our everyday lives. So how did fantasy go from this to this?
For Frodo.
Welcome to WatchMojo's series, How Geek Culture Became Pop Culture. Once niche and ridiculed, geek culture has exploded into the mainstream. How did so much change? Join us as we look at how pulp fiction, comics, video games, anime, and nerd heroes became pop culture staples. It's tempting to begin our story with a hole in the ground, and a certain Bilbo Baggins.
Good morning.
But fantasy has of course been around for a long time. Gilgamesh, King Arthur, Aladdin, these are all heroes whose stories involve fantastic, otherworldly elements.
It's all so magical.
Yeah.
The same can be said of folk and fairy tales. Like sci-fi, however, fantasy's journey into modern pop culture owes a lot to the pulp magazines of the 1920s. In particular, Weird Tales. Before this magazine debuted in 1923, fantasy was associated with children's books. Think Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and the Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
We must be over the rainbow.
The stories in Weird Tales challenged that notion, from H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu to Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian series.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good.
The latter is especially notable for establishing the sword and sorcery subgenre, and much later making Arnie a movie star. It was a set of much smaller, shyer heroes, though, that most shaped modern fantasy.
My friends. You bow to no one.
In 1917, as the First World War ravaged Europe, a love-struck young soldier named John Ronald Reuel Tolkien gazed at his wife Edith as she danced in a woodland glade. This moment would inspire the tale of Beren, a mortal man, and the elf maiden Luthien, a cornerstone in the world he had begun to create in poems, stories, and fragments. Tolkien had been sent back to garrisons in England after falling ill at the bloody Battle of the Somme. By the war's end, almost all his friends were dead. But the memory of their fellowship stayed with him, and he would go on to form a new fellowship as an Oxford professor, the legendary Inklings.
So be it. You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring.
Right. Where are we going?
Among this circle of friends, Tolkien continued working on what he saw as a new mythology for England. As a philologist, new languages came first, then people to speak them, and a world for them to live in. In the 1930s, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, and in the mid-50s came the novel that earned him his nickname as the father of modern fantasy literature, The Lord of the Rings.
There and back again. A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. And The Lord of the Rings by Frodo Baggins. You finished it.
Tolkien was inspired by British polymath William Morris's attempt in the 1800s to revive medieval romances. Following Morris's cue, Middle-earth existed as a completely standalone world. Unlike, say, Narnia, the world created by Tolkien's fellow Inkling C.S. Lewis, Narnia was connected to our own through portals of a sort, as well as thick layers of Christian allegory, a quality Tolkien despised.
What have they done?
Mind you, Lewis's portal fantasy would also prove influential. But it was Tolkien's high fantasy epic that would set the bar for the genre.
A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day.
Of course, that doesn't mean that suddenly in the 1950s everyone was reading fantasy. However, a notable milestone came in the 60s with the publication of The Lord of the Rings in affordable paperback in the US. In its wake, the declaration "Frodo lives" became a popular slogan of the counterculture, graffitied on walls and printed on buttons. With a small change in medium, Middle-earth had gone viral. The Lord of the Rings would go on to sell over 150 million copies.
May it be a light for you in dark places when all other lights go out.
Inspired by Tolkien came a slew of imitators and agitators, eager to create their own fantasy worlds. Some, like Terry Brooks, followed in his footsteps, while others, like Ursula K. Le Guin and Stephen R. Donaldson, struck out in new directions. The Lord of the Rings also influenced the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons, published in 1974, which in turn inspired Dragonlance, a sprawling shared universe of fantasy novels. This expansion gave fantasy fans a lot to read, but definitely did not make them less geeky to outsiders.
So Sam, will Logan the Huge be making an appearance?
I told you, I don't want to play.
What, you're too cool for us now that you broke up with Cindy?
No, I don't know. It's just, it's a geeky game.
D&D fans explored exciting new worlds by night, but were harried in high school halls. In fact, a moral panic even linked them to depression, crime, and demon worship.
Let their blood rain from the sky!
In general, the more passionate you were about the genre, the more ostracized. Which, of course, brings us to live-action role-players. Taking off in the 70s and 80s, LARPing allowed fans to live out their fantasies. Despite all the fun they were having, people thought that, well, it all looked pretty silly.
Sleep, friend. They can't hurt you now.
It was another shift in medium that would finally extend fantasy's reach, with mixed results. In 1978, Ralph Bakshi tried to adapt The Lord of the Rings, but struggled to capture the grandeur of Middle-earth.
I don't feel right going off without Gandalf, Mr. Frodo. I wish we could have waited, that I do.
So do I, Sam. But he said to leave as soon as we could. And Merry and Pippin insisted on coming with us as far as Bree.
Nonetheless, fantasy films exploded in the 80s. And like everything in the 80s, there was the amazing and the ridiculous. On the one hand, you had classics like The Dark Crystal, The Never-Ending Story, and The Princess Bride.
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
But on the other, you had a slew of campy shockers that, sure, make for fun nostalgia trips, but weren't exactly groundbreaking films with mass appeal.
Nothing is more magical.
A few other gems, like Labyrinth, did also make an impact. Heck, Bowie's crotch alone in that movie is still famous.
Magic jump, magic jump, magic jump, magic jump, magic jump on me. Slap that baby, make him pay.
But Bowie or not, these films with their mysticism and puppets reinforced the idea that fantasy was for kids. By now, sci-fi fans had Star Trek and Star Wars. Fantasy fans were still waiting. Fortunately, fantasy was maturing. Yes, previous fantasy writers had touched on sex and death and social and political themes. But in the 90s, new series like Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, and George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire combined high fantasy with a much more modern sensibility. Martin's books in particular were definitely not aimed at kids.
Drinking and lust. No man can match me in these things. I am the god of chits and wine.
The winds were changing for fantasy as the wheel turned and a new age came around. And it wasn't just for adult fantasy. The 90s also brought us a fantasy hero for a new generation, The Boy Who Lived.
Wicked.
Famously, J.K. Rowling's novel Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was rejected by 12 publishers before going on to become the best-selling book series of all time. Man, they must be kicking themselves. Like Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, the Harry Potter series involved a parallel magical world, although this time a world within and on the same plane as our own.
Welcome home.
Its titular hero was a relatable underdog, and Hogwarts was the ultimate fantasy for school kids and adults. Because who doesn't want to learn magic?
Oh, well done! See here, everyone. Miss Granger's done it.
Having said that, there were grumbles from stuffy types that while it was getting kids to read, it wasn't Shakespeare, damn it. In the US, it was alleged that the books celebrated witchcraft and therefore Satan. Fortunately, Harry Potter flew on over these objections with much better things to do, like hitting the big screen. 2001 was arguably the most important date in this story, when fantasy made the biggest impact in popular culture. It brought us two film franchise titans, The Fellowship of the Ring and Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, aka Sorcerer's Stone.
You shall not pass!
Both blew audiences away with their vivid visuals and sense of adventure. Peter Jackson's live-action trilogy went on to sweep the Oscars and make almost $3 billion at the box office. The Harry Potter series more than doubled that. Both spawned new series with The Hobbit and Fantastic Beasts.
Gonna put you back where you belong, aren't I, Frank? To the wilds of Arizona.
They also expanded into other media such as stage productions and, of course, video games, where fantasy has proven especially durable. Their success opened the floodgates for fantasy franchises like The Chronicles of Narnia and How to Train Your Dragon.
Come on!
And let's not forget beloved films like Spirited Away, Stardust, and Enchanted. Meanwhile, games like World of Warcraft and Skyrim immersed fans in fantastic worlds like never before. Fantasy was officially big business, but it had one final step to take in its epic journey from niche to pop, into our living rooms. In the 2000s, TV entered a new golden age thanks to quality shows like The Sopranos, The Wire, and The Shield, which had high production values and told complex stories. It was thanks to this wave that in 2011, Martin's unfinished A Song of Ice and Fire was adapted into the HBO runaway hit Game of Thrones.
The things I do for love.
There had been successful fantasy shows before. Hercules, Xena, and in animation, the beloved Avatar: The Last Airbender.
I need to ask you something. What? Please, come closer. What is it? Will you go penguin sledding with me?
But nothing quite like Game of Thrones. Featuring nudity and blood galore, this was not a stroll around the Shire or even into Mordor. It was gritty, brutal, political, unpredictable, and at times, funny.
I'm not a god. I know that. I saw your pecker.
In short, Martin took the rules for fantasy and said Dracarys, creating something that felt more like an historical epic. Okay, yeah, with dragons. The last season might have felt rushed, but Game of Thrones set viewership records around the world. Its success has paved the way for new series, such as Netflix's The Witcher and Dark Crystal prequel, and upcoming adaptations like Amazon's planned The Wheel of Time series.
It's not too late.
Magic doesn't work on me. Silver does, though.
Silver is for monsters.
Today, those kids playing D&D in the basement are actually the heroes on TV. And not even the sort of nerd heroes we're supposed to laugh at. Just regular kids who happen to like casting fireballs.
The Demogorgon is tired of your silly human bickering. It stops towards you. Boom! Fireball him, Will! Stop! Boom! Protect! He was in anger! And fireball!
Admittedly, it's not clear where fantasy goes from here. Will there ever be anything to match Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or Game of Thrones? As science fiction becomes daily reality, how will fantasy remain relevant? Fortunately, when it comes to fantasy and innovation, the sky really is the limit.
Balcord's even more beautiful than I thought!
After all, creating new worlds with new rules is part of the genre. And while fantasy still has a diversity issue, new voices are slowly changing up the genre. So we think we can say with Bilbo that the road goes ever on.
The road goes ever on. Until our next meeting.
Make sure to tune in for our next episode of How Geek Culture Became Pop Culture, where we'll be talking video games.